Thank you, everyone, and I look forward to the discussion after. I've got some prepared notes, and I've got some slides to try and pack as much into my limited time as possible. Everywhere you go, folks are folks. People want to live, laugh, work, travel, and start a family. I hope we all resist the negative stereotypes, the demonizing, the othering that so often proves catastrophic for vulnerable people around the world. Palestinians are no different from any of us in this room. But in the Western world, and especially in North America, they lack a voice, they lack a platform. And unfortunately, we do not have a Palestinian with us today to speak on the panel. So in my brief remarks, I want to share a little bit of what I've learned from studying the issue for almost 20 years informally and through my academics more formally for the better part of a decade, and having spent 6 months in the occupied West Bank. Specifically, I would like to clarify 3 things that I think seem very widely misunderstood in Canadian society and in the West more broadly. So in a nutshell, first, I'll say a few words about the Palestinian predicament, especially the occupation. Second, I'll say a few words about Palestinian popular resistance against the occupation. Third, I'll say a few words about Canada's inconsistent policy, which is actually, I and many others believe, anti-international law, anti-human rights, and anti-Palestinian. Before going further, though, I also think it's important to stress that the State of Israel has an international right to exist as much as any member state in the United Nations. And the Jewish people have an inherent right to self-determination. But this cannot come at the cost of denying the same for another entire people. And it doesn't have to. Now, to understand the Palestinian struggle, I think it's helpful to distinguish between 3 broad categories or classes of governance regime that the Palestinians are subject to. Generally, there's a bit of overlap here, but for the most part, they fall into one of 3 categories, either as refugees, or as Israeli citizens, or as people living under occupation. First, the refugees. Refugees originate from that crucial year 1948 when the State of Israel was created and the majority of the Palestinians were driven or fled from their homes, and then crucially barred from returning. They are stateless today, completely disenfranchised, mostly living in built-up refugee camps across the Arab world, generation after generation, and now numbering several million people. The refugees have it quite different from a smaller group of Palestinians, the Palestinian citizens of Israel. These are the minority of Palestinians and their descendants who did not flee or lose their homes in 1948. Today they're called the Israeli Arabs, or the Palestinian Israelis, and they number about 1/5 of Israel's total citizenry. They can vote, they can run in Israeli elections, they can become judges, hold political office, they have Israeli passports, and they can travel relatively freely. If one were to make a comparison with Indigenous Canadians, it would be to this group, the Palestinian citizens of Israel. Compared to the other 2 categories on this slide, the Israeli Arabs have it pretty good, although they certainly do face significant social discrimination and institutional marginalization, especially so since Israel passed its controversial nation-state law last year, which declared that Israel is the nation-state for its Jewish inhabitants only, not for its non-Jewish inhabitants or citizens. The equivalent, to keep with the analogy with Indigenous people in Canada, that would be like Canada declaring itself the nation-state of European-descended settlers only. Obviously, it would be an insult to the Indigenous population. So we have the refugees across the region, we have the second-class citizens of Israel, And third, we have those living under military occupation. These have it the worst. They're stateless and they're subject to Israeli military rule as their government. During the War of 1967, Israel went beyond its internationally recognized 1948 borders and expanded to take East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. According to international law, the acquisition of territory by force is inadmissible. And these are occupied Palestinian territories, not part of Israel proper. When you hear discussion about the two-state solution, the idea is that it's the occupied territories that will become the Palestinian state, with East Jerusalem as its capital. Palestinians accepted this formula 30 years ago, but Israel and the U.S. have refused to implement it. Instead, the U.S. and Israel have insisted on what seems like endless negotiations in order to impose conditions that the Palestinians cannot accept. It is true that the Oslo peace talks of the 1990s produced the so-called Palestinian Authority, or the PA, in the occupied territories, but this is an authority in name only. It does not extend beyond the management of social services and in a handful of disconnected municipalities. The PA does not control the West Bank. There's really only one government that exercises sovereignty in the occupied territories, and that government is the occupying power, Israel. Israel controls the borders, security, ID systems, resources, taxes, the currency, the birth registries, and the electromagnetic spectrum across the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. Unlike the minority of Palestinian citizens of Israel, Palestinians in the occupied territories are stateless non-citizens. They have no rights. They can't vote or run in Israeli elections or access Israeli courts or even travel freely, not even within the West Bank. Complicating the matter, as all of you will be aware, Israel has been building outposts, towns, cities called settlements, where Jewish Israelis are encouraged to move with government subsidies, even though it is illegal under international law for an occupying power to move its population into the territory it occupies. But every year, the settlements get bigger, and the settlers now number several 100,000 in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, a sizable minority. In the West Bank, this means that in the same territory, Israel applies two completely different regimes to two separate systems of law to two different people. One democratic government for Jewish settlers who are Israeli citizens, and one military rule for the Palestinians who are stateless. So what does the occupation look like? And I want to focus now on the occupation. I think these distinctions are important because when you don't hold these distinctions in mind, we can get very lost in confusing details. You'll very often hear when one person is talking about how bad Palestinians have it under occupation, and then somebody else will say, but they're free, they're citizens, they can become judges, they can become the directors of hospitals, they can run in the parliament. That's failing to distinguish between two very different regimes that Palestinians live under. In the occupied territories, Palestinians live under Israeli martial law. They're tried and convicted in Israeli military courts. They're held in Israeli military prisons. Hundreds of army checkpoints and hundreds of kilometers of walls and barriers stifle movement, stifle the economy, stifle life. Most Palestinians are not free to travel to Jerusalem. Even West Bank Palestinians who live within eyesight of the city are barred from visiting the city. They're not free to travel the country or to visit the beaches of the Mediterranean unless they obtain almost impossible to get permits from the army. In the occupied territories, Palestinian human rights are routinely violated by the army and by extremist settlers. Palestinian crops, cattle, infrastructure, and homes are regularly destroyed. Political activists are detained without charge and held for months at a time. Soldiers enter bedrooms in the middle of the night to arrest youth suspected of throwing stones. The Gaza Strip has it worst of all. completely blockaded and periodically bombed with drones and fighter jets. Several thousand Palestinians have been killed in the last 10 years. Of course, Palestinians fight back. They've always resisted, including armed struggle, which is, according to international law, the right of an occupied people denied self-determination. They have also resorted to terrorism, which has been very well documented and publicized, especially that period from the mid-1990s to about the mid-2000s. Palestinian suicide bombing was very common. It is not anymore. For the most part, and extensively, though little reported in the West, Palestinians have rich traditions of unarmed, participatory civil resistance, grassroots organizing, non-militarized struggle. Today, popular struggle is the major face of Palestinian resistance. This is the subject of my book, which is currently out in hardcover and available as ebook. In the West Bank, so popular struggle has become very common now across the occupied territories. The West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. In the West Bank, community-based organizations called popular committees are leading a remarkable campaign against the Israeli separation barrier. They have not succeeded in moving the barrier or having it completely dismantled, but in several locations they have altered its course. They have pushed segments of the barrier dismantled and pushed back off their land, sometimes pushed back to the green line, to Israel's internationally recognized boundary. The major strengths of this anti-wall, grassroots, popular protest movement has been its non-militarized and its transnational character. It has support networks from around the world, including many Jewish activists and organizations from Western countries, and even some from Israel itself. The popular committees have reached out and networked with international organizations, and now many of them are designated human rights defenders by groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and agencies of the European Union and the United Nations. This means that when Israel arrests or harms these activists, global networks spring into action, generating instant news reports, press releases, lobbying on their behalf. The international attention provides some cover to Palestinian activists, expanding their space for activism. Probably the most famous West Bank community to launch popular resistance in recent years is the village of Nebi Saleh, home to the young woman named Ahed Tamimi, who was jailed for 8 months for slapping an Israeli soldier. This story made a lot of news. How many in this room have heard the story of the teenage girl Ahed Tamimi? Most. In fact, that's her as a few years ago as a younger child, waving her fist at an Israeli soldier there in that picture. In fact, I did my research, some of my research in the village of Nebi Saleh in 2014, precisely because I had come to learn that the activists in this village were really leaders on the ground of the popular resistance movement in the West Bank. It's not just the West Bank, though. As I mentioned, in Jerusalem, too, in East Jerusalem, popular resistance has become the major form of struggle. Most prominently, in the last couple of years, tens of thousands of Palestinians have participated in mass nonviolent civil disobedience, shutting down the streets with collective prayer protests in order to challenge and sometimes effectively reverse unpopular Israeli security policy in the city. You may recall the most famous campaign in the summer of 2017 against Israeli-installed metal detectors at some of the holy sites, at some of the Muslim holy sites in the city. They were removed as a result of the coordinated and sustained civil disobedience in the streets. Unarmed and participatory struggle has become the norm in Gaza as well, as I'm sure all of you are aware. Every week, every Friday afternoon, thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of Palestinians march to the heavily militarized boundary with Israel, braving sniper fire to send a message to the world. They demand an end to the blockade and recognition of their right to return to their homes. Since the weekly marches began last year, 200 unarmed demonstrators have been shot dead and thousands more crippled and maimed. Palestinian popular struggle has also been going increasingly global. with activists in the occupied territories networking with solidarity movements around the world, including with progressive Jewish groups, with other social movements like Black Lives Matter, and with various indigenous activists and groups in North America, and other campaigns and movements as well. One of the major fronts of the global Palestinian struggle today is the BDS movement that we've already spoken about a little bit. The BDS movement, the boycott, divest from, and sanction, as it is formally known, though others describe it differently, is demanding an end to the occupation, equal citizenship rights for the Israeli Arabs, and the right of return for all Palestinian refugees. The BDS campaign was launched by Palestinian civil society in 2005. And it started small, but it has steadily grown. It's still nowhere near the scale of the international boycott campaign that contributed to the end of apartheid in South Africa. Yet it must be having some effect because it's always in the news, and Israel and the US and a few other countries are aggressively trying to shut it down, even legislating against it and painting the movement as anti-Semitic. So from the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, global BDS movement, Palestinian struggle today is predominantly grassroots, non-militarized, and is helping to expose the injustice and violence of the occupation. Indeed, apart from Israel, the US, and a few others, the vast majority of countries in the world support Palestinian rights at the United Nations and in their foreign policy. A growing list of countries have even recognized a Palestinian state, even though it's mostly a symbolic gesture, as long as the occupation persists. More materially, civil society organizations, church groups, unions, student bodies have been opting to divest from companies that profit from the occupation. It pains me to say that for more than 10 years, the Canadian government has been on the wrong side of these issues. Before Prime Minister Stephen Harper, Canada's foreign policy and record at the United Nations voting was in line with most of the rest of the world, calling for respect for international law and for Palestinian rights. With Harper, though, the Canadian government swung into the small rejectionist camp of the US and Israel. In fact, the Harper government was widely perceived as more pro-Israel than the US government. Israeli diplomats even joked that the Harper government was more pro-Israeli than the Israelis themselves. It was a Canadian Conservative minister, John Baird, who was the first international diplomat to meet formally with Israeli officials in occupied East Jerusalem, breaking with decades of international precedent, a decade before Trump came along and moved the embassy to Jerusalem. Stephen Harper once serenaded the Netanyahu family by singing Hey Jude at a fancy banquet in Israel. It's painful to listen to. With the Trudeau government, unfortunately, none of this has changed. The government of the Liberal Trudeau government has extended Harper's voting pattern at the UN in lockstep with the US and Israel positions and in defiance of the large majority of the world's countries. There have been no Chrystia Freeland tweets in support of Palestinian rights, like she tweeted, for example, in support of Saudi political prisoner rights and the rights of Venezuelans, which I think was the right thing for her to do. On the contrary, Justin Trudeau himself has tweeted his condemnation of BDS activism on Canadian campuses, and it was Trudeau's Liberal government that passed a parliamentary resolution condemning the BDS movement. This is all the more perplexing because it seems to contradict Canada's official policy on these issues. According to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for the last 30 years, Ottawa supports a two-state solution, recognizes the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip as occupied Palestinian territories, and considers the Israeli settlements illegal under international law. Yet, Canada's domestic and international behavior has been fully supportive of Israel, refusing to criticize Israeli rights violations, but criticizing instead all forms of Palestinian resistance, including the nonviolent movement to pressure Israel to adhere to international law through boycotts. This is not being a good friend to Israel. This is enabling counterproductive rights violations and extending the conflict. So in conclusion, far from the paragon of international human rights champion that many of us imagine Canada to be, at least on this issue, Canada is not only not in the lead, but near the back of the pack and pushing in the wrong direction. And this is the cover of my book, and for more info on this and to get in touch with me, you can use that website. And I'll stop there, and I look forward to hearing from all of you.